Hey, we are continuing our teaching series called Resilient. And Resilient is all about asking the question, what does it look like to live with resilience when your soul is tired during these turbulent times that we find ourselves in? And we've been using Psalm 23 as sort of the framework for this series. And Psalm 23 is arguably the most famous psalm that David, the one who wrote the psalm, had ever written. But this famous psalm wasn't written during a time of peace or comfort or ease or predictability. Far from it. Actually, this was written during one of the most tumultuous and difficult times in David's life. And so I think this psalm, chapter 23, really has a lot to say to each and every one of us as we navigate these complex and crazy and unpredictable and difficult times that we find ourselves in as well. And so each week we've been reading Psalm 23 out loud together. So wherever you are right now, I want to invite you to go ahead and open up your Bible, whether it's a physical Bible or the one on your phone, and let's read Psalm 23 out loud together. And the reason we're doing this is because we really want to get the words of this psalm from our head to our heart so that it begins to reach every part of our lives. Are you ready? All right, let's read Psalm 23 together. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessing. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Isn't that psalm amazing? I think it's just beautiful. And we've been kind of walking through this psalm verse by verse, and today I want to look at verse 4 of Psalm chapter 23, but I want to reread it from the New King James Version. Here's what it says. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Isn't that powerful? Look, today I want to answer this question. How do we keep walking even when we find ourselves weary, worried, and worn out? How do we keep walking in this life when we're weary, worried, and worn out? Are you weary? Are you worried about something? Are you worn out? Then this message is for you. You see, Psalm 23, it starts with David talking about his shepherd providing for all his needs. Letting him rest in green meadows and drinking from peaceful streams, and his strength being renewed as he's led along the right path. When you read Psalm 23, verses 1 through 3, it sounds like the life that we would all want. Who wouldn't want green meadows and peaceful streams and being renewed? But then we get to verse 4, right? And it feels like everything changes. The entire tone shifts. We go from green meadows, peaceful streams, and renewed strength to walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Sounds great, right? It leaves us all echoing the words of the great sage Ron Burgundy when he said, well, that escalated quickly. Right? From verse 3 to verse 4, it just escalates very quickly. All of this valley of the shadow of death talk that David writes, it's really a buzzkill to the green meadows, peaceful pastures, and renewal that he talks about in verse 1 through 3. But if I'm honest, this is another reason why I love Psalm 23. Because it's real, right? It's about how life really happens. And you know this. Sometimes you will walk through seasons of rest and peace and renewal, and those are great seasons. But then sometimes you can find yourself suddenly finding yourself in the valley of the shadow of death. Can you relate? Let me know in the chat. See, this can happen in the micro, right? It can happen in small ways. You're having a great morning. You feel rested. You actually had time to make breakfast and eat it. And then you get an email as you're eating your pancakes from your boss asking you to meet them as soon as you get in the office. And instantly, you go from resting in green meadows and drinking from peaceful streams to the valley of the shadow of death. Can you relate to that? But this also happens, this whiplash from peaceful streams to the valley of shadows, it can also happen in the macro, not just the micro, right? Life is going well. It's going awesome even. And then you get the call that your parent or a good friend received a diagnosis about their health, and it doesn't look good. Or it felt like your marriage or your relationship was healthy and thriving and flourishing, to then all of a sudden it falls apart. See, what I like about Psalm 23 is that David, he doesn't hold back any punches. Like, life is both green meadows and peaceful streams and valleys of the shadow of death. They're both. But here's the good news, according to Psalm 23. David seemed to believe that God is with us in both of those seasons. But I want you to see something that David says that's small, but I want you to know it's not insignificant. David, in what feels like he's talking to himself almost, he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? Like, he's going through a tumultuous time. His son had betrayed him. And so he's like, even though my own son has betrayed me, and his country right now is divided. So he's like, even though my country is divided, and even though I'd rather run from all of this, even though the shadow of death looms over me, even though I will walk through this and I will not be afraid. Why? How is David so confident? Because he knows that his shepherd is with him. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to get to the point in my life, in my faith, and I'm not sure if I'm there yet, I'll be honest. But I want to get to the point where I live with this even though faith. You know what I'm talking about? Even though life is bleak, even though the future is unknown, even though maybe I don't have a job, even though I don't know where the next paycheck's coming from, even though my marriage is struggling, even though I don't know how we're going to make ends meet or how I'm going to get through this, even though I feel lost, even though I see the struggle, even though I see all this, I won't surrender to it. Yes, struggle is present in my life. But even though that is true, I refuse to let it have power over my life. I want to have an even though faith. How about you? And you see, even though faith is not about not having fears. All of us have fears. The question is, will fear have you? Even though faith has made a decision, and that decision is that their difficulty will not be their destiny. Come on, somebody. Like David, they will keep walking, even though they're facing what feels like a valley of the shadow of death. Do you have even though faith today? You see, I find it interesting that David says he's walking through the valley of the shadow of death. It reminds me of one time when Jenna and I were living near the Presidio. There were these two raccoons. We had come back from a date night or something, and they had broken into our trash cans, and they were eating our trash in front of our front door. And so we weren't able to get in without passing by or through these raccoons. And so I kid you not, this is sort of embarrassing, but Jenna and I stood outside for 20 minutes contemplating our options. Because in our minds, we were convinced that these raccoons, they were out for blood, our blood in particular. I think in our minds, we had concluded that, this is how it probably ends for us. Finley will become an orphan because her two parents were killed by bloodthirsty raccoons on our front door when we came home from date night. Fear can convince you of crazy things like this, isn't it? But it reminds me of a saying that I once heard that said, I've had 1,000 problems and hardly any of them came true. I mean, how true is that? For all of us, if we're honest. I mean, how many fears have we had that we were convinced would happen that didn't? But even though Jenna and I survived that night, I can tell you that I did not walk past those raccoons. No, the spirit of an Olympic sprinter filled me, and I have never run so fast at any point in my life. I sprinted through that front door, and I survived, and so did Jenna as well. I find it interesting that David, he didn't set up camp, and he didn't refuse to enter the valley. But what's also interesting to me is it doesn't say David sprinted through the valley of the shadow of death, but it says that David walked through it. He didn't set up camp because David knew something that we need to know also if we're going to be resilient during turbulent times. And what we need to know is that fear is a terrible refuge. You can't set up camp under fear because fear is a flimsy tent to try and place your life under. But also, David didn't sprint through the valley. He walked through it. You don't get this sense that David is panicking. It doesn't feel like David is just trying to get to the other side as quickly as possible. And while I don't want to assume too much when I read this, it feels like David has a sense that the valley isn't a detour, but the valley is actually a part of the journey that he's on. That the valley is a part of the journey that the shepherd, his shepherd, is leading him through. And because of this, David knew that he had to walk through it. David does not write that his shepherd carried him through the valley. He didn't throw him over his back and walk him through the valley. No, David had to walk for himself. He had to get moving one step at a time. See, David seemed to understand something that those who live with a sacred resilience understand. They understand that in the valley, God will always walk with you, but God doesn't walk for you. God will always walk with you, but God doesn't and can't and won't walk for you. It reminds me of what the psalmist would later write in Psalm 107, verse 10. He says, "Some sat in darkness and deepest gloom, imprisoned in iron chains of misery." They just sort of set up camp where they were. David and the psalmist of 107 knew something about resilience that we're going to need to borrow during turbulent times in our lives. And what is that? We need to borrow this understanding that you cannot choose your difficulty, but you always choose your direction. You can't choose your difficulty. That's outside your control, but you can always control what direction you will take. This reminds me of what Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychologist who survived the Holocaust, he would later write in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he would write this. He would say, "Forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in life, but you can always control what you will feel and do about what happens to you." I want to remind some of you that there is a difference between being victimized and being a victim. You see, being victimized is an event you didn't choose, a terrible event that you did not choose. But being a victim is not an event, it is a decision that you make every single day. See, I'm inspired by the stories of the women from an organization we've worked with here at Canvas called Black Women Revolt, where all of the women involved in this organization, they have been victimized. And yet none of them, not a single one of them, will call themselves or see themselves as victims. They see themselves as survivors, as fighters. You see, that's what walking through the valley of the shadow of death looks like. It's deciding that our painful valleys, our painful, difficult seasons will not make me a victim, nor will it make me a villain, because I am choosing the path of the victor. Are you living like a villain? Are you living like a victim? Or are you living like a victor? See, I find it interesting that David did not say that he was in the valley of death, but instead he says, "I'm in the valley of the shadow of death." It was not so much death that he faced, but it was the shadows that death created that he was navigating. See, today, some of you already might be deciding that you want to live with an even though faith. And you've decided the direction of your life and that you will walk through the valley, walk through the process, walk through the journey that God is leading you through. But I'm telling you, if you're going to have the resilience to walk through the valley, then you, like David, are going to have to face some shadows. So I want to spend the rest of my time looking at that idea of shadows. See, while many have said that David was referencing the reality that we all face, and that is our death and mortality, the Hebrew word that David used here is more about deep darkness or gloom in David's life. So it's like when David says he's walking through the valley of the shadow, when he says shadows, it's like David is saying, even though I have a shepherd, I'm still grappling with some real struggles and with some real battles in my life. And I don't know about you, but that comforts me. I mean, David, you may not know this, he has a nickname in the Bible given to him by God. And what is that nickname given to David by God? It was a man after God's own heart. Like you would think this man must be close to perfect. But even this man, a man after God's own heart, had some internal battles that he was navigating. Psalm 23 feels like a psalm written by a person who is self-aware and open about his internal struggles. And you see, there's no greater place to discover who you really are and what you're really carrying in your soul than in the valley. See, the struggles we face have a way, and you know this, right? They have a way of revealing the shadows we have. And so if you're going to be resilient in the valley, we're all going to have to learn how to shadow box a little bit. And so I want to spend just the rest of our time today teaching you how to shadow box. If you're going to have an even though faith, and if you're going to walk through the valley, you're going to also have to learn how to shadow box. So I want to give you just a few truths to remember when you find yourself in the valley of shadows. A few truths to remember about your shadows. Here's the first truth. I want you to go ahead and write this down wherever you are. Wherever there's a shadow, there is light. Wherever there is a shadow, there's light. See, what is true for shadows on a wall is true for shadows in our soul. And that is that shadows only show up where there is light. Shadows can't be seen if there is no light. And I wonder if some of you have maybe seen shadows show up in your soul these last couple years. Maybe it was a shadow of insecurity. Maybe it's been a shadow of fear. Maybe it was a shadow called greed. Or a shadow of bitterness began to show up these last couple years. Chances are that even now, you could probably think of an area in your life that some shadows have shown up, even in the last week or the last hour. See, I know because I've been in the valley of shadows and it can feel like the shadows are consuming everything around you. And it's tempting in that place to assume that the shadows are evidence that God has left you. But you know, I've thought that, and maybe you've thought that or are thinking that, but I've come to a different conclusion. See, if shadows cannot show up without light, then perhaps it's the same with the shadows in our souls. What if shadows are not an indicator that God has left you? But what if your shadows are actually an indicator that God is with you, shining in your heart and shining in your soul? And it's because of the light of God shining in your life that there's some shadows showing up, because there are things that have been sitting in the dark corners of your heart and of your soul, of your life, that God graciously and lovingly right now is trying to reveal so that you can be healed. What if our shadows are just the ghosts of that which haunt us, and God is turning the lights on in order to reveal what needs to be healed, because God knows something, and that is that something can't be healed as long as it's concealed. So maybe instead of running from the shadows, God is actually inviting us to the source that is blocking God's light from shining unobstructed in your life. Wherever there's a shadow, there's light. But here's the second truth about your shadow. Shadows always appear larger than the object really is. And you know this, right? Shadows always look larger than the object creating the shadow actually is. I mean, this is a lesson that all of us probably learned by the age of 4, right? When we cried out for our parents because we were convinced that the large shadow being projected on the wall of our bedroom at night was in fact the monster we knew was hiding under our bed. And then your parents came in after you yelled for them, and they proceeded to show us that it was not a monster, but it was just your Beanie Baby that was sitting in front of your nightlight. Like, let's be honest, how many times have we thought our Beanie Babies were boogeymen? See, what we learned that night as children, but often forget as adults, is this: what you fear is not always fact. In fact, I've heard it said before that fear means false evidence appearing real. What you fear is not always fact. Small objects can make big shadows in our lives. And before you run from the shadow, it might be worth finding the source of the shadow first. Have you ever held a grudge against someone because you were convinced, like you knew it, that they did something, said something, or thought something about you, and then you later found out that you were wrong? That it was actually a total misunderstanding the entire time, that it was actually smaller than you originally thought? I mean, perhaps you live under the shadow of abandonment and you're convinced that it's not safe to have deep friendship because they will always end in abandonment. But that's just not true. Everyone won't leave you. It's just not true. That's the shadow on the wall. But if we were to find the origin of the shadow, we might find that you have unresolved or ungrieved grief over your dad or mom or friend who left you at some point in your life. Some of you might be living underneath the shadow of fear of failure. So you're paralyzed in making a decision because you fear that if you make the wrong decision, that your entire life will fall apart. But that's the shadow talking. Because you know that chances are, if you left your job to start something new or you took a risk, you'd be okay, even if it didn't work out. But if you follow that shadow to its source, what you will find is a childhood message that you were given that your parents love you, or that your worth is contingent ultimately on your success and achievement. And that's really what's going on. Shadows always appear larger than the object actually is. Get to the source of the shadow, and you'll likely find something small. So small that it might have gone unnoticed or ignored. And I'm not saying just because it's small, it's not significant. But sometimes these small things can bury themselves in our hearts. And we get used to them and forget that they're even there. And then those small obstructions create big shadows in your life. Wherever there is a shadow, there's light. And shadows are always bigger than the source. The third thing is this: the bigger the shadow, the closer the light. See, this is so important. The bigger the shadows, the closer to the light you are. I mean, if you have a flashlight right now, just put your hand closer to the light in a dark room and you'll see the shadow of your hand just grow. The bigger the shadow, the more you can know that the source of light is close. And friend, as the last couple of years has created some large shadows in your life, I want to invite you to take heart. Because where the shadows are large, it means the light is near. Now, as weird as this might sound, when you begin to see shadows looming larger than ever in your life, is it possible? Consider it. Is it possible that it's because you are actually near to God and God is near to you, you're not far from God? Is it possible that the shadows are signs that healing is closer than you think, that hope is closer than you think, that your restoration is closer than you think? What if the enemy of your soul would love nothing more than for you to run away from your shadows, because your enemy knows that if you were to run towards your shadows, that you would end up running into the light of God's love as a result? Perhaps the best thing we all could do is run towards our shadows, because we know that the bigger the shadow, the closer the light. Maybe the best thing we can do is run towards that shadow of abandonment so that God can meet us there and we can experience His unshakable presence in our lives. Maybe the best thing we can do is actually not run away from the shadow of abuse, but run towards the shadow of abuse so that God can meet us there and begin to offer us healing. Maybe the best thing we can do is run towards the shadows of fear that we have. Fear that we'll never have or be enough, so that God can meet us there and show us that He is enough, that He has been enough, and He will always be your provider. See, maybe it's only when we, like David, walk towards and walk through the valley of the shadows of death that we'll be able to say at some point in our lives, like David says in Psalm 24:4, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. I wonder what valley of shadows you've been running from. Friends, you cannot walk through that valley of shadows if you aren't even willing to walk towards the shadows themselves. And whether or not you will walk towards the shadows, that is a decision that you must make for yourself, that not even Jesus can make for you. But even though Jesus cannot walk for you, let me remind you that Jesus has been, currently is, and will always, I promise you, will always walk with you. And with that, let me read the words of Jesus to His disciples after warning them that this life would not always be green pastures and peaceful streams and times of renewal, but would also be full of valleys of shadows. Jesus encourages his disciples with what feels like discouraging news. And I hope his words speak to you as well as you move towards the shadows in your life and into the light of God's love for you. Jesus says this in John 16, verse 33. He says, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. May you live with an even though faith, that even though you're walking through something difficult, you refuse to camp out in the valley of the shadow of death. No, instead you are going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and you're going to walk towards your shadows, because you know the bigger the shadow gets, the closer to the light you are, the closer to God's love, God's healing, God's hope, and God's restoration that you are.